It really feels like every day we hear about another way our online activities are, well, being tracked and analyzed. It makes you wonder how much of our digital lives are truly private these days.
It certainly does.
So today we're going to dig into something that shines a pretty stark light on this a massive multi-billion-dollar settlement. It says quite a lot about how tech giants handle our personal data. And this deep dive is brought to you by Stonefly leaders in enterprise storage, backup, AI storage, and cloud solutions. If you need secure, ransomware-proof storage, maybe air-gapped or immutable, check them out. You can contact sales at stonefly.com for a demo.
And right off the bat, the scale here is just, well, fascinating. We're talking about the state of Texas and Google reaching a $1.375 billion agreement.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of figure isn't just pocket change. It really suggests the issues involved are pretty significant when it comes to, collecting and using our information.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. The core issue here basically involves claims that Google was tracking users' digital footprints in ways they hadn't properly agreed to. We're talking about following where people went physically, what they searched for privately, and even collecting things like their voice prints and face geometry.
That's exactly it. And it involves services most of us probably use all the time. Chrome, Google Maps, Google Photos. The key accusation is that this tracking happened without people being fully aware or, giving clear consent.
And when you mention voice and face data, that's important because Texas law actually has a specific term for this, doesn't it?
It does. They call them biometric identifiers,
Okay.
which covers things like retina scans, fingerprints, and crucially in this case, records of your face geometry or your voice print. Really unique personal stuff.
Yeah, very personal. And what's interesting is how Texas actually pursued this legally. I understand they don't have one single big data privacy law like California, for instance.
That's right. They used a couple of existing laws instead. One is specifically about capturing or using these biometric identifiers, the CUBI Act, they call it.
CUBI, okay.
And the other is their broader Deceptive Trade Practices Act, the DTPA, which protects consumers from, well, unfair or misleading business practices. So they basically use the tools they already had in the toolbox.
So tackling modern privacy issues with existing consumer protection laws, that's quite a strategy.
It is, yeah. Especially when federal action is lagging.
Now, back to that huge number, $1.375 billion. Google agreed to pay it, but they haven't actually admitted they did anything wrong, have they?
No, and that's pretty standard in these kinds of large settlements. Companies often choose to settle just to avoid long, expensive, and uncertain court battles. It doesn't necessarily mean they agree with the claims. It's often a pragmatic business decision.
Right, sort of a let's make this go away move without formally admitting guilt. And it's also interesting, Google apparently says they've already put in place many of the policy changes related to these complaints.
Yeah, they claim a lot of this is already addressed, which, makes you wonder about the timing. Did the lawsuits push those changes internally?
Hmm, possibly.
Regardless, it's really important to note that this settlement, despite the huge dollar amount, doesn't actually require Google to make any more changes to its products or how it informs users going forward.
That is surprising, isn't it? For such a big number, you'd almost expect some mandated changes in behavior.
You might think so, but nope, not in this particular agreement.
Okay, so a big part of this lawsuit also focused on Chrome's incognito mode. Now, that's supposed to be the private browsing option, so what was the issue there?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit confusing for users. The allegation was that even when you were using incognito mode, Google was still collecting your browsing data.
Right, which kind of undermines the whole point, or at least the common perception of it. People think incognito means you're invisible online.
Exactly. But the reality is, well, quite different. Incognito mode mainly does two things. It stops your browser from saving your browsing history, cookies, and site data locally on your device.
Okay, so on my computer.
Yes. And it deletes cookies after you close the incognito windows. But what it doesn't do is stop your internet service provider from seeing your activity. It doesn't stop the websites you visit from logging your visit. And crucially here, it apparently didn't stop Google itself from collecting data associated with your browsing session.
Ah, so it's more about local privacy, hiding your tracks from someone else using your device, rather than true online anonymity from the sites you visit or the browser provider itself.
Precisely. It's not a cloak of invisibility online. And, raises a fundamental question. If your web browser is made by a company whose core business is advertising, driven by understanding user behavior,
Well, how private can that browser truly be, even in its private mode? That's a really good point to consider. Definitely food for thought. Now, the other major piece was this collection of biometric data. What was the argument there? How was Google supposedly mishandling voice and face data?
So the core argument under Texas law was that Google was gathering these unique identifiers, think voice commands via Google Assistant or Nest devices, or facial geometry scanning in Google Photos for tagging, without getting what the law considers clear and informed consent beforehand.
They weren't being upfront enough about it.
Essentially, yes. The claim was they weren't adequately telling people, hey, we were about to capture your voice print or scan your facial features, and then getting explicit permission before doing it, as required by Texas's CUBI Act.
And that Texas law, the CUBI Act, it has pretty specific rules, right? Not just general guidelines.
Oh yeah, it's quite specific. Companies need to inform people before collecting biometric data, get their written consent, affirmative consent, not just buried in terms of service, and they also have rules about data retention, security, and prohibiting profiting from it. The lawsuit alleged Google fell short on these requirements.
So Texas is really putting its foot down when it comes to protecting this very personal biometric information. And thinking about it, this isn't the first big tech privacy rodeo for Texas, is it?
Not at all. You're absolutely right. This $1.375 billion settlement with Google, it's actually the largest state-level privacy settlement Google has ever faced in the U.S.
The largest. Wow.
Yeah. And just to give some context, remember that multi-state coalition lawsuit against Google over similar location tracking issues. 40 states involved.
I do, yeah.
Their combined settlement was significantly smaller, around $392 million. So Texas, going it alone, secured, well, substantially more.
That really underscores how aggressively Texas pursued this.
It certainly does. And it fits a pattern.
Yeah.
Texas also previously secured that massive $1.4 billion settlement with Meta, Facebook's parent company, over its use of facial recognition technology.
Right, I remember that one too.
So you put these two massive settlements together in a relatively short time frame, and it really positions Texas as maybe the leading state enforcer on privacy right now, especially since there's no comprehensive federal privacy law.
It really sounds like Texas is stepping into that vacuum saying, if D.C. won't act, we will use our state laws to protect our citizens. What do you think the wider ripples of this settlement might be? Does it send a message?
Oh, I think it almost certainly does. The sheer size of the dollar amount could definitely embolden other states. Attorneys general in states with similar biometric privacy laws, or even just strong consumer protection statutes, might look at this and think, hey, maybe we should take a closer look at these practices too.
Like a blueprint for action.
Could be, yeah. It's a kind of benchmark, maybe a precedent. If Texas can secure over $1 billion, it might make similar lawsuits seem more viable elsewhere.
And does this kind of financial hit actually change company behavior, even without specific mandates in the settlement?
Well, that's the big debate, isn't it? There's a strong argument that hitting companies with billion-dollar penalties, even without admitting wrongdoing or requiring specific product changes, does create a powerful incentive. It makes inadequate privacy practices a significant financial risk. They might change things proactively just to avoid the next costly lawsuit.
So the cost of not prioritizing privacy becomes too high.
Potentially, yes. It becomes a serious factor in risk assessment. And, looking globally, it's interesting to contrast this enforcement-first approach with what's happening in Europe. There you see more focus on things like the consent or pay models, basically, get explicit consent for tracking or offer a paid version without tracking.
So different philosophies at play, Europe focusing maybe more on upfront choice architecture, while Texas is showing teeth with enforcement after alleged violations.
That's a pretty good way to put it. And the whole conversation is broadening too, beyond just privacy to wider data governance issues, things like your right to access your data, correct it, maybe even move it easily between services, data portability. That's becoming a bigger theme globally.
Okay, so wrapping this up then, this huge Texas-Google settlement really throws into sharp relief that ongoing tension, doesn't it, between how much personal data tech companies gather and our own expectations, maybe our rights, to privacy. And Texas is clearly taking a very strong stance.
Absolutely. And it serves as a crucial reminder for all of us, I think. Features marketed for privacy, like incognito mode, often have significant limitations. They aren't necessarily the magic invisibility cloak some might assume.
Which means really the onus is still largely on us as users, doesn't it? To try and understand how our data, especially that really sensitive biometric stuff, is actually being collected and used. We can't just tick boxes or rely on default settings.
Definitely. Which leads to a final thought, maybe for you to ponder. Given that this massive settlement didn't actually force fundamental changes in Google's practices, what are the most effective paths forward for genuine data privacy and accountability? Is it just about tougher laws? More aggressive state enforcement like we see in Texas? Or is it more about educating and empowering users with better tools and transparency? Where should the focus really be?
Hmm. That's a deep question to leave us with. Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. And a reminder, this was brought to you by Stonefly, a leader in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions. If you're looking for secure, ransomware-proof storage with air-gapped and immutable options, contact sales at stonefly.com to schedule your demo.